Welcome to the Gentleman Project podcast. I'm Kirk Chugg.
And I'm Corey Moore. Today we have one of my very good friends, longtime friend, Ron Smart. Ron and I have an affinity for golf. We both love to golf, so we've done a lot of golf outings together over the years. Ron is the best putter I know. How old are you now, Ron?
First of all, you don't know a lot of people then.
Whatever.
Actually, I'm 67.
You're 67, and I don't know a lot of other 67-year-olds who still hit their driver 300 yards, but this guy's
and he doesn't know
got it
here either.
He hits it pretty long. But Ron was the CEO and chairman of the board for the One Door Corporation, sometimes known, I think you and I have talked about this, Ron. It's like one of the biggest companies in Utah, and they have fire doors and according doors in nearly every major building in the world. Wow. I mean, you name it, airports, the Pentagon, everywhere, right, Ron?
Sears Tower, the Empire State Building, we're in them all.
You name it, there's fire doors. And so sometimes I feel like it's one of the biggest unknown companies in Utah, for some reason under the radar.
Yeah, that's because we don't do anything residential, and so everything's commercial. And so we've done so much work with Big D Construction because they do such an amazing job on commercial construction. But yeah, we don't do residential advertising. We don't do any of that. And so it's really major commercial buildings. So every major casino, every major high rise, like you mentioned, hospitals, nursing homes, all those types of structures. And
every single person in the world, I would imagine, dang near, has walked through a building with one door in it.
Yeah, we can safely say that.
You can safely say that. So, but more importantly, this guy's a gentleman. He's always been a gentleman ever since I've known him. He has amazing kids, an amazing wife. I know them all. And so I was thrilled that he agreed to be on the podcast and talk to us a little bit about his family and what turned him into a gentleman and why his kids are a gentleman. And so thank you, Ron, for being with us.
Well, I appreciate it so much.
I'm really excited to hear some of the things that you've done. I've met a couple of your boys before, and they're in the family business as well. And I'm excited to maybe talk to you a little bit about that dynamic. So talk to us a little bit about your family. Tell us about your family first and what your family makeup is, so that everybody can kind of get an idea of who they're listening to today.
Okay, I think like most of us, we marry over our heads, and I certainly did with my wife, Jody. She's an amazing, amazing person. Met her actually in high school, and why she waited for me to get all the things done that I needed to get, and still we were able to get married, and she was such an important part of my life, and we've been married for 45 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We have 2 kids. She has diabetes. We actually lost our first one. She got the chickenpox during the pregnancy, and then the first child that came 2 months early and brought on the diabetes with her, and so we were lucky to get the 2. In fact, after our son was born, the doctor said, there's no chance of having any more because of her condition. But we're blessed with 2 wonderful kids and then 7 incredible grandkids that I'm not biased on at all, but they're amazing. Yeah, I'm just grateful. So, and our kids married great kids. So when you talk about the 2 boys, you're talking about both my son-in-law and my son that you've met. They're both really fantastic. So, and I feel the same about our daughter-in-law. So she's an amazing person too. So we're appreciative of a great family. They're marvelous.
Well, if you know Ron at all, I'm glad you brought up Jody first, because if you know Ron at all, you know he really loves his wife. It's one of those where he can't hide it, right? He wears that on his sleeve.
I love that.
Not that you would try to hide it, but it's just one of those things where he's always talking to me about, this is what Jody's up to, and this is how Jody's doing, and this is what Jody and I decided. I mean, he makes business decisions with Jody and life decisions with her. And so I always have admired that of you, Ron, that you know, it's you and Jody. You're a team.
That's exactly right. And I think that's so important in life. And you talk about gentlemen's projects. I think it was Bruce Barton that said something to this effect, that when I think about the tremendous consequences of little things, I'm committed to believe there are no little things. Jody does a lot of little things for me that nobody ever notices. I mean, I always seem to get the biggest dessert, or there's just other little things that she does, but I still open the car door for her, and I still open every door for her. I still hold her chair. Now, some women may not like that, but I always want her to know that I will never take her for granted. When you marry someone and you feel like you're going to give your life, well, most of us feel when we marry our spouse that we give our life for them. And so when that stays within you and you feel like, yeah, that's somebody I'll give my life for, you need to live for them too. And you need to be a team and have them a major part of your life. It's been a good thing, but it's a lot of little things that I think she and I do for each other. I know she doesn't take me for granted, and I'm sure she knows I don't take her for granted. I think one of the greatest things that you can do for your kids is first love your spouse. I think that's a very important part of a marriage and a family, is that the kids don't see you fighting, but they know that you just love each other with all your hearts, and we do.
So I'm really interested to know some of your best practices when it comes to strengthening a relationship in your marriage. You've got to have a few things that you decided to do early on or during your marriage of 45 years that have served you well. Would you mind sharing some of those best practices with us? What are some of the things you and Jody do for each other to keep your relationship strong?
Well, we spend actually quite a bit of time together, and I had the advantage in that with One Door, and then another company had bought us actually back in 1986. But then they were a public company. They got into some financial troubles, and so they had asked me to take over as president of that company. They had about 2,400 employees. I didn't necessarily even want to take that position, but somebody had to, and so I did. I acquiesced and took the position. And so I had to travel a lot. And so we tried to, rather than give our kids a lot of material things, we tried to allow them to travel with us whenever we could. And so that they could see not only domestically how great the country is, but also the rest of the world. So my kids have been to Moscow, they've been to St. Petersburg, they've been to the East Germany, West Germany, they've been to most of the European countries, and they feel like I do that when they get back to the United States, they just want to kiss the ground, because there's so many great benefits and things that we have here that I think are taken for granted. So one of the most wonderful things that we were able to do for our kids, and I know not everybody can do this, but we were able to let them see how other people live as opposed to giving them a lot of material things.
Since I've known you, you've been what I would call a gentleman. Talk to us a little bit about how you became who you are, right? You're kind, you're well-spoken, I've only seen you being nice and kind to others around you. Maybe talk about how did you become the gentleman you are, and who influenced you, right? Was it your parents? Was it leaders? Talk a little bit about that, and what did they do to turn you into who you are today?
That means a lot to have you say that, Corey, but it was my parents. My dad, without question, is my hero in life, and I feel just the same about my mom. They were amazing people, and the biggest thing I think that they always talk to us about is the importance of integrity, but they did it not only with their words, but they did it with their actions. Maybe I could just illustrate this with a story as far as his integrity. And he was downtown one day, and an individual came up to him and said, Jay, he said, I'm just furious with this relative of yours. And my dad, not knowing what he was talking about, said, well, why? And he says, well, he borrowed some money from a group of us and promised that we'd get this kind of a return and that it'd be paid back at this time. And nobody's been paid back. And our understanding is he's lost the money. And my dad said, well, let me check into it. So he talked to this relative who he loved very much. And the relative said, I screwed up. He said, I thought that I'd be able to get this money back to him, but I was scammed a bit. But he said, I did. I just have not been able to get the money to pay them back, and I don't have it. So my dad worried about what that would do to our family name. And so he went to my mom, and my dad was working for the government at the time. And he was actually working for the governor. And at the age of 43, he lost his job when the governor changed to the different party. But so they didn't have a lot of money. But my mom and dad met together, and they decided that they would take a second mortgage out on their house and pay everybody back. I remember my mom telling me the greatest day of her life was when they paid that second mortgage off. I'm going to take this full circle and tell you kind of what happened. When my dad then lost his job at the age of 43, it was not that long after the Depression. There were not a lot of jobs available, and so the only job he could find was to sell on strictly commissions storm windows. And at that time, energy wasn't a big topic. And so he ended up, the area they gave him was Pocatello, Idaho. And so he had to go up and go door to door selling storm windows. Well, as you may guess, most people were slamming the doors in his face. And after a few weeks, he was really discouraged and told me that he broke into tears because he was so discouraged. He was feeling like he was letting my mom down and everybody down. And then he said the sun just happened to hit the glass of the little sample window he had just right. And he looked at it and he said, this is it's a good product. The problem isn't the product, the problem's me. So he says, I've got to rethink this on how I'm going to be successful in selling this. And so he went back, and the first lady that was willing to talk to him, he said to her, listen, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, because you're going to see a major savings after you put these windows in. And if you don't, I'll give you all your money back. But if you do, I will give you part of my commission if you'll tell your neighbors after a few months of looking at your bill. Sure enough, it did save a lot of money. It's pretty cold up there, and it did change your bill dramatically. And she did talk to the neighbors. And I remember driving down that street one day with him, but he'd say, this house and this house and this house, but he'd show me all the houses that they had the windows in. And then he picked up a line of folding doors. And I'll tell you the name of the company. It was called Splendor. And he started a company called Splendor of Utah, where they sold the windows and then sold the folding doors. Went and he met with the LDS Church, and he actually got it in a lot of the buildings in the LDS Church. And so he became Splendor's biggest distributor, biggest salesperson. And everything was going great until Splendor had a major fire in their plant. They just couldn't pull themselves out financially, so they ended up selling to another company, which I'm not going to tell you the name of that company because it's still in business today. But when that company got this particular door, they decided they wanted to make a little more profit on it, so they started to cheapen it a bit. And you'd have to know my dad. He will not sell anything that he doesn't completely believe in. So he called them up and he said, at least for this one customer, because I promised them that it'll be this durable, that it'll take basketballs and people hitting it, and they were just cheaper components. There were just a lot of things that my dad didn't feel good about. And so he said, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to find a way to get them that product. And they didn't think he could. And so They said, well, we're not. This is what we're going to do. So again, my dad goes back to my mom, and he says, listen, I know how hard it was on you to take out that second mortgage, but would you be willing to do that again so we could get the dies and equipment and things and start manufacturing a product that maybe is similar to the original Splendor, but was better? They went ahead and made that decision. But then my dad went to the bank, and it was at that time, banks had a little more flexibility than they do now. The representative at the bank told my dad, he said, Jay, I just don't think it's probably going to fly, that there's just not enough in your home to get enough money to fulfill all the things that you need with the dies and the machinery and all the things that you have to have. And he said, but I'm going to take it to the board anyway. So he went to the board of the bank. Sure enough, when he came back, he told my dad, he said the proposal was going down in flames because there just wasn't enough collateral to handle the loan. Until one board member said, wait a second, is this the same Jay Smart that lives in Holiday, Utah? And the representative said, yes, it is. He says, I need to tell you something about him. He said, I had lended money to a relative of his way back when, and I knew Jay knew nothing about it. I know Jay knew nothing about it. Yet he and his wife had the integrity and paid us all back. And he said, I would trust that man with my life. After he said that, the whole board just changed their attitude and they approved the loan. It was only because of that that got started. They started manufacturing. It was actually a gentleman that was the head of the building department at the church. They went out and saw the first installation, and they kicked it and hit it. And he turned to my dad and he says, you know, if Splendor was named after the adjective splendid, this door is just wonderful. And that's how One Door got its name. It all comes back to a simple act, well, maybe not so simple at the time, to take out the second mortgage and things to pay off somebody, but you never think that that would ever come back to help you in any way. But wow, that was a big lesson. And I wouldn't be where I am today if he didn't start it. And then he got cancer. I took over the company at the age of 24. Wow. So I was really young. Luckily, he was still alive. I could bounce some things off him, but I've run it since the age of 24.
What an incredible legacy story that is.
Yeah, that certainly affects your son and your other kids and your grandkids, I'm sure, have heard this story.
They have. To know that their grandfather and grandmother had that much integrity. Corey, we've done enough business, and I know your integrity is amazing, and I'm so grateful for everything we've done. But I think you've seen with me, if there's ever a close call, I'll just take the hit, because to me, integrity is far more than any amount of money. One of the books that I recommended to my kids that they read, and it's not necessarily my favorite book. In fact, it's not my favorite book that I've ever read. I've read a lot of books, but it's called The Ultimate Gift by Jim Stovall. Have you ever, where he was a multi-billionaire, but his family had become spoiled, completely spoiled. Because of that, he was worried when he died on how best to leave all the inheritance. And there was one grandchild that was really spoiled, and he wanted to teach him life's lessons. And so he talked about these ultimate gifts, and he wouldn't give him any of his inheritance until he went through. And so he learned the gift of friendship and the gift of time and the gift of love and all these other different, there were 12 gifts, I think. Finally, this young man recognized and started to find joy, because having money doesn't bring joy. Everybody wants it, and I want it. I mean, we work for it, and we try to do good things with it. The fact is joy comes from making a difference in the world and knowing that you're doing some good things. You mentioned with our doors on 9/11 when the plane hit the Pentagon, and literally in that area there were 2,000 military employees. Several hundred died because the plane hit directly into it. And actually, we had 38 doors in the Pentagon at the time that the plane hit. The plane took out the jet, took out 2 of our doors. We can't stop a jet. But all of the 36 doors shut, sealed off. I was an LDS mission president in Oregon at the time, so I didn't get to fly back. But literally, our engineers, when they flew back, they said on the one side of the doors automatically shut when a fire happens and things, and they all work perfectly. And they said on the one side where the fire was and things, the smoke was so thick, inches thick on the walls and the ceiling, that you just write your name on it. On the other side, they were as pristine as the day they went in. And that's why Donald Rumsfeld was able to actually, right in front of our door, have a news conference the next day that the Pentagon would be opened that very next day. And it was because we were able to keep all the smoke and fire into that one major area. And now the Pentagon's put over 150 of our doors in because they work so well on 9/11. And we were credited with saving pretty much most of those 2,000 lives. So we were pretty proud of that day.
Well, and if you think about it, what if your dad hadn't done the things he did? What if he hadn't taken out that first, second loan?
That's exactly
what
true,
if
Corey.
he hadn't decided to start One Door?
And I don't know if One Door would have ever been started if he hadn't have taken out that loan, because I don't think he would have gotten the bank. He didn't have enough collateral. I don't think the bank probably would have approved the loan if that one board member hadn't have spoken out. And there's no way that he could have ever known that that would ever come back to help him. And so the one thing about my dad when I was growing up, and he was so unique with this as a father, and I've tried to do the same thing, even with the amount of travel that I've had to do. I try to get back to every recital, every ball game. I tried to coach. It cost extra, and I do it even on my own, at my own expense, to fly back so I could be a part of their special events, and then I'd fly back out and finish what I needed to do. But I really always tried to make sure I was there for my kids, but that's because my dad was always there for me. He'd come home from work sometimes, and I know he'd have a bad day, but he could read me. He could read when I had a bad day. And instead of saying, well, tell me what's going on, he knew I love sports. And so I was a pitcher when I was young, and I played a lot of basketball. And so he'd say, let's go in the backyard, and I'll let you pitch to me. I'll catch for you. Or he'd say, let's just go shoot some hoops. And he'd usually just feed me the ball and let me shoot the hoops. But he was always able to get out of me what was bothering me. But he didn't just sit down and say, oh, come on, tell me what's going on. He did it in such a unique way, and I always had that major respect for him. In fact, and I've talked to my siblings, that when we had friends that were going to do maybe some things that might hurt my parents a little, I always backed out of it. But I talked to my older sister. She said, I had the same feeling with Mom and Dad, that I just never wanted to hurt them. I think that's a pretty amazing legacy that he left for me. He was just so caring, and my mom was the same way. She was just amazing. But to watch how they treated each other, again, I know the world's changing, and there's some women that you hold the door for them, and it's like the story that the woman said, well, are you holding this because I'm a woman? And the guy said, no, I'm holding it because I'm a gentleman. Has nothing to do with whether you're a woman or not. I hold it for, and I do the same thing. If a guy's coming through it's not, whoever's coming through, I'm going to hold that door open, just because that's how I was taught. But at the same time, I want my wife to know that she'll never be taken for granted, because she's everything to me.
Ron, is there a moment in your fatherhood experience that you look back on as one of the neatest experiences of being a father, or an experience that taught you a life lesson while being a dad, that you just say, that was the pinnacle of my fatherhood experience so far?
We took them to Moscow. It was right after the Cold War, and there were tanks on a lot of the corners of the streets. And I don't think they would ever believe that until they saw it and saw really what was happening. And because of that, and they've been amazing kids. They're far better than me. And my son, who actually graduated from BYU, he went in mechanical engineering. Then he went and worked for Pratt & Whitney, did a lot for them. He worked on some secret military things that to this day he can't even tell me about. He came back to get his master's degree, and he worked for ATK. And they had some problems with their rockets, because the nose cone design was bad, and so several rockets had crashed, and so he knew about that. So for his master's thesis, he came up with a computer program that no matter how the design of the rocket changed, the nose cone would automatically change so it would fit perfectly to fly the rocket at the exact trajectories they needed through any atmosphere. Well, when ATK got a hold of that, they said, who in the world did this? Because our engineers, it used to take them 8-9 months to figure all that out, and now they can do it in 10 minutes. His main professor down there kind of talked to Scott and said, because this works, this is going to be a lot harder master's program. Maybe we ought to go to the board and see if we should make this your doctorate and do something quicker for your master's. And Scott says, the only reason I'd want a doctorate is to teach, and I don't want to teach. I just want to do. The fact is when they had those job fairs, everybody wanted him. He'd go to the job fair. He'd give his name, and they say, you don't need to fill anything out. The job's yours. We have a job for you if you want it. And so I told him, listen, buddy, I'd really like to have you, but we're talking these huge companies that want you. I want you to do what you want. And he said, Dad, I've always wanted to work with you. And that meant the world to me. That was a big thing for me. And so even though other companies really could afford to pay him more than I was able to, he still came back with me, and it's worked out great because we love working together, and I certainly love working with him, and he's been such a superstar. But to kind of go back to your question, I think that's a life-changing event when you know your kids still gravitate to you when they can go anywhere they want to.
I like that. It's a good answer. I'm sure that having the last name Smart was a pretty good bookmark for some of those recruiters. In the engineering field,
when they talk to me,
too.
it's in name only. So, but for him, yeah, he's a pretty smart kid. But when you talk about me, it's just my last name. I'm not that smart. So much that I'd like to make my kids understand on the respect side, whether it be your race, your religion, your political affiliations, any disagreement that you may have with people. It's okay to have those, and I think it's important to speak out, but that doesn't mean you have to hate those people or you have to dislike them. That you need to show people that you care. It doesn't matter what religion they are. You just love them. You care about them, and people grow up in different circumstances. They're going to have different feelings. I try to have my kids understand that not only to not be offended, but to look for the good in people. That doesn't mean you have to agree with them. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't speak out, right? But again, I think that comes back to showing that integrity that you have, but at the same time respecting others, showing love for others regardless of what it may be. I had a chance to marry a lot of couples. I also had a chance to interview a lot of different couples for marriage, but I'd always have them look each other in the eye and say 3 things. Look at each other and with all your heart, tell the other person that you love them. And so they do that. They look at each other and they say, I love you. And I said, hey, you've got to keep that, not only with your words, but with your actions, to keep showing that love through the marriage, because that love can go away if you don't keep working on it at all times. Next, I want you to turn and look at each other and say, I'm sorry. And so they look at each other and say, I'm sorry. In a marriage, you've got to know that none of us are perfect. We're going to make mistakes. And I'm sorry is a pretty big deal in a marriage. But I said, the third thing, I want you to look deep in each other's eyes and say, we can't afford it. They look at me like, well, what are you saying there? And here's the problem with so many marriages, that you leave your mother and father, you cleave to each other, but you want to have the exact same lifestyle that your mom and dad have worked 30, 40 years to give you. And the reality is that's not how it happens. And so you've got to recognize that as you get married, you're starting over in many ways, and that you've got to be willing to really be cautious about what you can afford and can't afford. Because the second you get into credit card debt and other kinds of debts, you're never going to pay those 17 to 21% interest credit cards off. It's ridiculous. So you've got to be so careful with that. And so my kids always still joke there and they say, I love you, I'm sorry, and we can't afford it. and I've had a number of couples come back and say, we still use that line all the time with each other.
That's awesome. Well, Ron, we actually end the podcast with the same question every time. And that is, what does it mean to you to be a gentleman?
I think it comes back to respect. I really believe that it's respecting other people and then treating other people as you'd want to be treated. In different cultures, the word gentleman means different things. But you hear that, a respectable gentleman. That respect just ties into being a gentleman. Then a lot of little things go along with it, as I've mentioned.
Thanks, Ron.
Awesome, Ron. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thanks for what you both are doing, because if there's ever a time that we need a gentleman's podcast, now's the time.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate everybody being a part of the podcast, even the people today who are listening, maybe for the first time. There's a lot of content here over the last year and a half that we've tried to create that we hope that you can look at the titles or look at the people that we've had on and go back and find something that might impact you at the stage of life that you're in right now. And hopefully today, some of those stories about integrity of your dad and the ripple effects of integrity throughout generations will have a good effect on somebody listening today when they're faced with decisions on whether or not they should act with integrity or not. That answer would always be yes. So
thanks, Kurt. Yeah.
Thanks, Ron.
So appreciate the opportunity to be with both of you.
And thanks for listening today. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do so. Jump over to your favorite podcast platform and like, subscribe, share, and drop us a rating and a review. We really appreciate that. I'm Kirk Chugg.
And I'm Corey Moore. Be ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, everyone.